Hey there, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Alicia. Today we're going to be talking about all of the books that I ended up reading in the month of February. So without any further ado, let's get right into the video. I have a nice big old cup of tea today because over the last couple of weeks I've been having a sore throat. I had a really bad cold a few weeks ago and it developed into a cough, and whenever I get a cough it lasts for weeks on end, sometimes even months. So my throat has been a little bit sore. Don't worry, I don't have COVID. I got tested. I'm clear. I just have a sore throat. So I do have a nice cup of tea to keep my throat hydrated, and I might take some breaks just to give my throat a break. So with that, I will go ahead and talk about stats, then go into my 1DNF, and then talk about the books that I read. Timestamps will always be linked down in the description box in case you don't care about listening to stats. I just include them for people who do like them. So in the month of February, I ended up reading a total of 10 books. Out of those 10 books, 2 of them were romance books. I know, shocker, me reading romance. That is new, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more. One of them was a memoir. Another one of those was a poetry collection. 2 of them were fantasy, and 4 of them were mystery thrillers. So I do think that this month I read a little bit outside of my comfort zone, which is good. And I did end up finding something that I really liked within a genre that I don't usually read. So I ended up having 3 5-star reads, 2 4-star reads, 4 3-star reads, and 1 2-star read. So it was a little bit varied. Like I said, I had 3 books that I really enjoyed, but most of them ended up being just average reads for me, unfortunately. I did end up having 1 DNF. We will get into that soon. But out of the 10 total books that I ended up picking up, 4 of them were from my physical TBR, 6 of them were from the library, and all of them were through audiobook format. So with that, let's get into my DNF for the month of February. I ended up DNFing Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Ling Tan, and this is book number 1 of the Celestial Kingdom duology. So I did end up looking for an interview with the author just to make sure that I categorized it correctly, and she did say that for her, this is a crossover of an older young adult book and an adult book. And so this is a debut, and in this one we are following the daughter of the moon goddess. Her name is Xingying, and it's based on a Chinese mythology of the moon goddess. So it is a retelling. And so in this one we do find out that the moon goddess has been imprisoned because she became an immortal when she wasn't supposed to. It was supposed to be her husband, and gods and celestial beings do not take kindly to being cheated. And so because of this, the moon goddess hid her daughter, so no one knows of her existence until one day she starts to radiate her magic, and so another powerful celestial being comes and ends up visiting her in the moon, and so the moon goddess has to go ahead and send her daughter away. The writing was beautiful and it is very lyrical. So unfortunately I did end up DNFing this at about 30 to 40% through. It just wasn't working for me. I don't know if this is something that might have changed by the end of the book because I didn't finish it. It just felt like Xingying was having no character growth. That really frustrated me. This was coupled with this weird irregular pacing. Some areas of the book felt like they were dragging on and they felt very repetitive and slow. And then all of a sudden things felt like they were happening very fast and without rhyme or reason. So because of that, I did DNF it. It might be one that I try again later on. I just didn't feel like continuing on right now. So the next book that I ended up reading in the month of February is a poetry collection, and it is Call Is What We Carry by Amanda Gorman. As soon as this came out, I knew that I had to pick it up. I love the cover. It's beautiful and it's stunning. I ended up giving this poetry collection 4 out of 5 stars. I really did enjoy the majority of the poems in here. They were very lyrical, and I really felt like Amanda's voice really shone through. I really also like that she played with format and with form, because for people who are new to poetry collections or to reading poetry, poems can really drag on or they can feel endless, but by having these very unique formats and by playing around with the way that she introduces poems in her book, she's able to go ahead and break up the pages so it doesn't feel like the poems drag on. I'll show you some of the ways that she does that. Like, look at this. I know that seems a little bit daunting. Not all of them were like that. Some are told in like the form of documents, which I also found very inventive and very new. She uses history and definitions and historical documents to discuss issues that are plaguing our country today, and I just thought that was so creative and so well done. I'm sorry. Oh. Ooh, okay. If you're new to poetry and you're intrigued by Amanda Gorman, I would definitely go ahead and recommend this poetry collection. I thought it's really well done, and I think it's a perfect place for beginners to start because it is very digestible. The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of February was a memoir, and this is Crying in Mart. Michelle Zauner is the singer-songwriter from Japanese Breakfast, which is a band, and that's actually the reason why we ended up picking up this book, because Ben is a really big fan of Japanese Breakfast, and as soon as we heard that she had a memoir, we're like, yes, we have to go ahead and read it. And so in this memoir, Michelle guides us through several vulnerable and intimate moments of her life. And here she explores her Korean American identity. There's also some exploration of grief. Her mother did pass away from cancer, and she's coming to terms with not seeing eye to eye with her mom all of the time. Some of the issues that she brings up that really resonated with me are these generational and cultural barriers that she talks about that separated her and her mom, or really prevented her and her mother from getting really close to each other when they were younger. You know, when you're an angsty teen and you just don't see eye to eye with your mom or with your dad. And those issues resonated with me, especially the part about dual identities, where she's grappling being Korean enough but also American enough. That's something that I can relate to, not feeling Mexican enough or not feeling American enough sometimes. Another thing that I really loved about this book is the description of food. She uses food as a catalyst to talk about her culture, and oh my goodness, the descriptions of Korean food just made my mouth water. I just wanted to eat the entire time while I was reading this. And I know some people have trouble with descriptions of food in books because sometimes they tend to get out of hand, but I thought it was perfectly balanced. It was just enough description of food and it was sprinkled throughout, so it wasn't overwhelming. One of the lines that really sticks out to me is when she talks about meal prepping and how that's a very American thing. And I completely understand that, because in my household, if we were craving tamales, we would make tamales and eat them for 2 weeks if that's what we wanted. No meal prepping. Or if we're craving pozole, that's what we make. Food isn't seen as just a task or something to get done or something to get out of the way. Food in some cultures that are not American are seen as a time for family to come together and to gather around as a way to experience culture. Unfortunately, I only gave this book 3 stars, which is not a bad rating. It's an okay rating for me. I liked the book. I didn't particularly love it. I didn't find it life-changing. I think Crying in Mart would have been suited better as a collection of short stories. This really needed tighter editing. It felt very choppy. You can definitely tell that Michelle is not a writer. She had a lot of ideas, but she didn't really know how to tie them together into a cohesive plot. So overall, as I was reading it, even though I was enjoying it, it just felt like there was no clear direction and it definitely lacked structure. It just needed tighter editing. But yes, that is Crying in Mart. The next 2 books that I'm going to talk about are fantasy books, and they're completely different. I think I'll go ahead and start with The City We Became by M.K. Jemisin. And I ended up picking up this book for the Read in Color book club that is hosted by This Story Ain't Over. So The City We Became is an urban fantasy, and it is set in New York. This is the first book to the Great Cities trilogy, I believe, and I ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. Now, the idea of this is brilliant. It is so creative, and I actually can't wait to read the second one, because I feel like now that we got the exposition out of the way, that the story is really going to take off. And so this is a tricky one to talk about, but this is essentially N.K. Jemisin's love letter to New York. And so at the beginning, we start off with a birth. The main avatar in this world is giving birth to the city of New York, but something goes wrong. There is an evil force that prevents this from happening, who wants the city to be destroyed. And so now this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because our main avatar is hurt and 5 other avatars have now come alive. Each of them represent one of the 5 different boroughs in New York City, and they must band together, find the main avatar, and help this avatar defeat the forces of evil. So the premise of it was so creative, and I had really high hopes for it, but unfortunately the execution didn't work for me. Part of that is that as a reader, I didn't really have a reason to care, if that makes sense. I wasn't attached to the characters, I wasn't really attached to the plot, and I didn't really care what happened overall. And part of it is that the characters didn't really feel like characters. They were supposed to be personified versions of these boroughs, but I'm not from New York, so I didn't really have an idea of how these characters were supposed to act or what their motivations are supposed to be, because a lot of the time was really focused on giving them this particular personality that resonates with that borough. So because of that, it feels like you never really uncover the true motivations of the character and what propels them forward as a character with motivations, rather than this representation of this borough that all of a sudden they have to take on. Another thing that didn't work for me is that it didn't feel like there was this building of tension that was needed. We know that there is evil out there and we know that it's orchestrating something, right? So there should be this intrinsic tension that should be built as these avatars are finding each other and coming together, but you don't ever really feel it. We know that the stakes are high. We know that something bad is going to happen, but it doesn't really do a great job at building that suspense and building that tension in order to pull the reader through. So at the end of the day, even though I thought it was a super creative concept, it just felt flat for me. I still am looking forward to the second book just because I feel like it can only go up from here, but I did struggle a little bit to get through it. So yeah, that was The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. The next book that I ended up finishing in the month of February is another fantasy, and that is Kalpa Imperial, The Greatest Empire That Never Was. This is by Angelica Gorodischer and it is translated by Ursula Guin. It's interesting because I ended up picking up this book at a very timely time, I guess I would say. Angelica Gorodischer just recently passed away in February, and I was extremely saddened because even though this is the first book that I read by her, she was well lauded in Argentina. And yeah, it makes me sad that she passed away. So this is a fantasy book that is unlike any other fantasy book that I've ever read. I would categorize it as literary fantasy, and this is a novel that is told as a series of short stories through the eyes of this very ill-tempered storyteller with a propensity to insult us, the reader. So in this book, we trace the repeated rise and fall of this fictional empire as it switches from king to queen through all of these transfers of power, from when it's a very small secluded town to one of the greatest empires that ever was. So the book spans hundreds, even thousands of years. It's not ever really clear because we aren't giving any dates, and the characters that are brought up, we never even truly follow them for any more than a paragraph or a couple of pages. So this is really a book that takes a bird's eye view approach. We're watching everything from up here. We never really get close to the characters, and we never really follow one straight trajectory when it comes to the plot and to the plot development. It's one that really focuses on themes and patterns, and its main focus is on power, the way that it is built, the way that it wanes, the way that it is transferred. And you know what? I really enjoyed it. It was a pleasant surprise. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. I'm just going to read a small passage for you so that you get an idea of what this book sounds like, because it will not work for everybody. Like I mentioned, the storyteller is irascible, and it's a book that moves very slowly. It's definitely one of those books that rewards readers who read very slowly or who like a little bit more of a literary approach when it comes to fantasy. So here it is. He was a good emperor. I won't say he was perfect, because he wasn't. No, my friends, no man is perfect, and an emperor less than anybody, because he holds power in his hands, and power is as dangerous as an animal not fully tamed, dangerous as acid, sweet and fatal as poisoned honey. But I do say he was a good emperor. He knew, for example, the right side of the coin from the wrong side, and that's already a great deal to know. So along with the history of this empire, we're also getting the opinions and the witty observations of the storyteller, who is unnamed. I wish there was something that I can compare it to. I did read someone else's review that said that the closest thing that they can compare it to is the Silmarillion. And I found that to be particularly interesting because I don't know anybody who would pick up the Silmarillion without already loving Lord of the Rings and reading The Hobbit. So I found that really interesting. And one day when I do read it, I can make the comparison to see if it really is like it. But that is the closest thing that someone else compared it to. Really interesting, really refreshing. And I found it particularly pleasant in a strange, slow way. So that is Kalpa Imperial. The next 4 books that I ended up reading fall within the mystery thriller category. The first one of those I will be very brief on because I did mention it during my Are These Thrillers Worth It video, which I will link down below. That one is going to be Finlay Donovan is Killing It. I ended up loving that book. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. Finlay Donovan is Killing It is another one that was a pleasant surprise for me. It was just so much fun to read. Finlay as a character is sort of like watching a really bad train wreck, but you can't look away. She is just so relatable. No matter how hard she tries, no matter what she does, everything just seems to go wrong in her life. And so Finlay is a writer. Her and her husband are divorced. He has a new girlfriend and she's struggling to pay the bills. She got an advance for this book that she was supposed to be writing, but she is having writer's block and the bills are piling up. And so she ends up meeting with her editor at this Panera that she has previously been kicked out of. And she starts to describe this plot to her editor. While they are there, someone overhears this conversation and they think that Finlay is a contract killer. And so she is hired to kill someone else's husband for a very large sum of money. And even though Finlay doesn't want to go through with it, things just start to develop in a way where she gets caught up in this whole thing and she sees no way out. It's definitely one of those books that is over the top. There's so many unbelievable things that happen in this book, but that's what made it really fun to follow. It was one of those books where I could turn my brain off and just enjoy the ride. And like I said, Finlay was super relatable and super funny. She also has this babysitter called Vero, who becomes a trusted friend and accomplice. And I really love the dynamic between their friendship. It was just such a super fun and super funny read, and I really loved it. The next book on this list is another book that I ended up giving 5 stars in the month of February, and that is All Her Little Secrets by Wanda and Morris. And I would categorize this as a legal thriller. So this is the complete opposite of Finlay Donovan. It has this very dark tone throughout. The stakes are high, and it was also super fast paced. I do have to mention content warnings for rape and rape of a minor. Like I mentioned, this is a book that is very dark with its tone, so please do keep that in mind before diving in. In All Her Little Secrets, we are following Elise Littlejohn, and she is a corporate lawyer. She is the only Black attorney at this office. Elise went through a bunch of stuff when she was a little girl, and there's no one really at the office that she feels like she can trust. And so she doesn't tell anybody about her past. She doesn't talk about her family life. People at her office don't even know that she has a brother. Elise was also having an affair with her boss, who one day ends up being murdered in his office. And the next day after he's murdered, Elise is promoted to take his job without her approval. She was offered the job and she said, "Hey, let me think about it because this is a weird time for me to be promoted and I don't even know if I want to stay at this company." But then her company does something shitty where they announce that she is taking over. Biggest red flag if you have ever seen one. So Elise ends up sort of going along for the ride because she feels like she really can't say no. She is also now in a position of power to make real change. All of this goes downhill as she starts to notice that she may be implicated in the murder of her boss. All of a sudden, all of these small nefarious things start to happen and she starts to realize that even her life may be in danger. I am telling you, I was engaged from start to finish. It's also told in dual timelines, and so we're following Elise as she's trying to figure out why her boss was killed, and we're also following Elise when she was little to find out what she's hiding from her childhood. Super, super, super well done. I loved it, and I can't wait to read more books by Wanda and Morris. So that was All of Her Little Secrets. The next book on this list is Shiver by Allie Reynolds. This is a mystery thriller set in an isolated setting. I ended up giving this book 3 stars. I was really pulled in by the atmosphere and the setting, and this is also one that is told in dual timeline. And so in the present timeline, we are following 5 friends who are meeting up again in the French Alps, Swiss Alps. I think it's the French Alps. All of them used to be professional snowboarders, and we find out that one of them in their group went missing. So in present day, they were all invited to this resort, but they don't really know who invited them. And now for whatever reason, they're not able to make it down the mountain. Now in the dual timeline, we do follow these friends as they are training, sleeping around with each other, having a good time. And all of this is leading up to that person's disappearance. And so let's talk about what worked for me. I personally love the set setting. This group of friends are snowboarders, and Ben and I do go snowboarding. So I could picture a lot of the things that the author was referring to. It does heavily talk about snowboarding, but I think the author does a great job at explaining all of the technical snowboarding stuff that she talks about. So you don't have to be a snowboarder to read this book or to understand what's going on, but it does heavily lean into that because of the nature of this group. So to some people, I can anticipate that this would be too much talk about snowboarding and about brands and about sponsorships and stuff like that. The author also really does a really good job of building tension and really spreading the secrets and the blame evenly across everyone so that you don't really have an idea who is responsible for this reunion or who is taking all of their stuff away. I thought that was really well done. The reason I only gave it 3 stars is because I wasn't really interested in the past timeline. The person that went missing was a very manipulative person, and I didn't really care for following all of those manipulating games, if that makes sense. And then one thing that I do want to mention, that I'll briefly mention because I don't want to give spoilers, there is some bad representation of queer characters in this book. I will go ahead and try to link a review down below if I can find one that doesn't give any spoilers. So that was Shiver by Reynolds. The last thriller mystery that I ended up reading was a YA thriller, and that is 5 Total Strangers by Natalie Richards. This is the book that I ended up giving 2 stars to. It's just a book that didn't work for me. In it, we're following this high school girl who is trying to make her way to her mother's house for Christmas. She lives with her dad, and we find out that her sister died the year before or something like that around Christmas, and so she doesn't want her mom to spend the holidays alone. Now she's flying back home across the US during one of the biggest blizzards of all time, and because of this, her layover flight is canceled. And so she decides to hitch a ride with a stranger that she met on the plane and 3 other people that will be joining them along. Now this is another scenario where things start to go missing and we don't really know who in the car is doing all of these things. We also find out that our main character has a stalker. So some of the chapters are told from their perspective as they're obsessing over our main character. The reason that it really didn't work for me is because right off the bat, I knew who it was. I am terrible at finding out who the perpetrator is, but I knew right from the beginning who it was in this situation. Like, I almost wish that the author would have told us right from the beginning, hey, it's this person, and then gone deeper into his mind, into the ways that he's trying to sabotage this trip while everybody else doesn't know what's going on. I kind of wish it was told in that perspective, because at least it would have been interesting to hear this person's thoughts as they were doing all of these things. Another thing that I really didn't like is that a lot of these characters felt very one-dimensional. They were very flat characters. There was no substance to them, and because of that, I ultimately didn't really care for how the story was going to progress. So that is 5 Total Strangers, and I gave it 2 stars. So it's actually the next day. I had to go ahead and take a break because I just had a coughing fit last night and my throat was really hurting. So I'm going to talk about the last 2 books that I read in the month of February right now. Both of them were romance reads, so they were both outside of my comfort zone. I don't read too much romance. I like romance in other genres, but I don't actually read from the romance genre very often. So it's definitely a genre that is relatively new for me. I'm still trying to figure out what I like in my romance and what I don't like. So hopefully over this next year, I can go ahead and dip my toes in it occasionally and really find books that work for me. So I do have 2 books for you today. One of them I gave 5 stars to, and that was How to Fail at Flirting by Denise Williams. This is a contemporary romance, and I do have to give content warning, specifically abusive relationships and on-page abuse. This is mostly told as a series of flashbacks, so it is not present in the current main relationship. Our main character had a past abusive relationship, and she's still dealing with the PTSD and the trauma from that relationship, so we do get flashbacks of that. So if that is something that bothers you, I would say to go ahead and stay away from this book. And so the premise of this book is that we have Naya. She is a professor and she is teaching at this school. Ever since she got out from that abusive relationship that she was in, she really just focused on her work and on getting tenure. And so she became someone that doesn't normally go out or go on dates or anything like that. She's also going through a rough patch because the school has hired an external party and review all of the departments to see which ones are making money and which ones are not. And they do expect cuts to be made over the next couple of weeks. and she's afraid that she's going to be cut from her department. So through all of this, she does have two very close friends, and they want to see her get out more. They want to see her be happy. They want to see her be a little bit carefree. And so they make a list for her to do, like going out to the bar and meeting up with a stranger, doing something spontaneous, etc. And so one day she's supposed to meet up with one of her friends at this bar, but unfortunately they couldn't make it, and she ends up meeting this guy named Jake at the bar who is in town for some business. They both just hit it off right from the beginning, and it's not until we find out that Jake is also on this panel that is going to review her department that they both become a little bit hesitant about their relationship and how to move forward with it. So let's talk about why I gave it 5 stars. Jake and Naya were just both really great and believable characters. I love that we were able to dive both into Naya and who she is as a person and who her friends are, and also see that through Jake's side. We get to see some glimpses into his previous relationship and also his friend group. So on their own, both characters were just very whole and believable. Now when it comes to the romance and the relationship, it was very easy, it was very fun, it was very playful. It's definitely cheesy. There are quite a few eye-rolling dad jokes in the book, which I personally like. I love romances that are cheesy and where there's a lot of banter and it's very playful. But the author also does a great job at throwing in some wrenches into the relationship that they have to work through. So it's not just all fun and game. They actually both get to learn and grow from those wrenches that are thrown in. I'm trying to be vague so I don't give any spoilers. So overall, both of the characters and the relationship felt believable and realistic and something that can happen in real life, which is what I really liked. So that was How to Fail at Flirting by Denise Williams. The last book that I ended up reading in the month of February was Alot like Adios by Alexis Daria, and this is the second book in the Primas of Power trilogy series. It's a romance series that follows these primas or cousins, and you don't have to read the first one to read the second one. So in this one, we're following Michelle, and Gabriel. This is a friends to lovers romance. It also has elements of fake dating, forced proximity, and fanfics. That's actually one of the elements that I really loved about this particular book. Gabe and Mish were best friends growing up, and when they were younger, they would write fanfic. There was a show that started where there was Latinos in space, and they were both super bummed when they didn't keep making new seasons. So they decided to take up the mantle and write fanfic for this. And I really liked those chapters, primarily because they both had such passion for this, but also because you start to realize that the fanfic sort of mirrors who they are as people in the real world, and they really just wrote themselves into this fanfic, which just made them feel like more real characters in this book. I also really liked the dynamic and the chemistry between them. It really did feel like they were best friends who were getting to know each other, but now there's some romance in there, and you do see them struggle between trying to reestablish this friendship but also knowing that there's a little bit more that was unexplored and they want to explore it. This one actually does have a lot of steamy scenes, and the scenes do get quite steamy. Now, I'm someone that personally doesn't enjoy those elements of the book, so I just ignored them or breezed through them and skipped them. And even though I skipped those particular scenes, I felt like there was still enough of other elements for me to enjoy this book. Ultimately, I ended up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. Even though I did enjoy it more than You Had Me at Hola, I definitely preferred this one. The reason that I only gave it 3 out of 5 stars is because there were some weird elements in there for me. One of them was that it felt like the author was trying to shoehorn in diversity. And what I mean by that is that she introduced these diverse characters, but they just felt randomly selected and they were left unexplored. For example, Mish and Gabe are supposed to be bisexual. It's an element that was kind of thrown in there as they sort of try to navigate their sexuality, but there wasn't enough time in the actual storyline for them to really talk about it. It was just kind of like thrown in there, and then that's it. It's not mentioned again. And then it's also brought up that Gabe has a transgender niece, but it was just mentioned randomly right off the bat. So it just felt like she was throwing in these characters to have diversity, but without really exploring those elements in the book. So I just felt a little bit weird about that. So another thing that bothered me about the book is that, so this is set in New York, that is where Mish and where Gabe grew up. Gabe had a tumultuous relationship with his parents. He felt misunderstood, he didn't feel supported, so he decided to pick up and leave and go to California to really find himself and to pursue his dreams. Now while he did this, he ended up completely ghosting Mish for like 10 plus years. They didn't talk. She would message him and he left her messages unread. He never replied. So now 10 years later, when he's trying to set up a gym in New York and his business partner accidentally reaches out to Mish, it opens up this channel of communication between Mish and Gabe that wasn't there before. And the way that the forced proximity worked is that Mish was behind it all. So she's like, hey, you're gonna come to New York, and when you're here, you're gonna stay at my apartment, which by the way was being renovated, so they actually ended up staying at her parents' house. He felt uncomfortable, rightly so, and he wanted to leave, and she's like, no, you're gonna stay. So that was just really weird to me. One, you haven't spoken in over 10 years. You're inviting essentially this very random person into your home and forcing them to stay. And two, if someone says no and they want to leave, you should let them leave. You shouldn't force someone to stay with you. So that was just a little bit weird to me. I didn't like that. And then the third thing that really put me off from A Lot Like Adios is that there was a lot of miscommunication. They both had things that they wanted to tell each other, but they just wouldn't. They just wouldn't. Even though before they had been best friends, they just weren't willing to be vulnerable enough in their adult lives to tell each other this stuff. So that just really bothered me. But I am excited to read the third one that comes out because I feel like that one is going to be my favorite. We've gotten glimpses of the prima who is supposed to be in the third one, and I think I'm really gonna like her. So that was A Lot Like Adios by Alexis Daria. So those were oh, perfect, right on time. So those were all of the books that I ended up reading in the month of February. If you made it this far, leave a flower emoji down below, or let me know how you're doing. How did February treat you? How is March going? Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Bye!